The world often shifts in moments that appear sudden, almost violent in their emergence, yet they are usually the culmination of long-simmering tensions and choices made far earlier. The strike launched by Israel on Qatari soil, an act that has reverberated far beyond the Gulf and deep into the corridors of power across Africa, Europe, and the Americas, is one such moment. The consequences of this assault cannot be measured only in terms of the lives lost or the damage inflicted. It is a rupture that calls into question the norms of international conduct, the fragility of diplomacy, and the willingness of smaller states to stand defiant in the face of unchecked aggression. Into this tempest steps Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, a leader whose words have become synonymous with defiance and whose gestures increasingly reshape Africa's position in the global balance. His response to Israel's decision to attack Qatar has startled observers and unsettled those who presumed Africa's leaders would remain passive. To understand why his words shook Benjamin Netanyahu, one must first trace the contours of this crisis and then follow the arcs of history, principle, and ambition that guide Traoré's intervention. Israel has long lived in a state of perpetual security anxiety, surrounded by nations it distrusts and groups it sees as existential threats. Its military doctrine has often been built on preemption, on the idea that striking before being struck is a survival necessity. Yet, when Israeli jets crossed into Qatari airspace and unleashed firepower on facilities said to host channels of support for Hamas, they transformed not only their relations with Doha, but also the calculus of global politics. Qatar, a small yet immensely wealthy Gulf state, has walked a fine line for decades. It is simultaneously host to the largest American military base in the region, a mediator in conflicts stretching from Afghanistan to Sudan, and a patron of movements Israel and its allies despise. Its influence is not measured merely in its gas reserves, but in its ability to amplify voices through Al Jazeera and to lubricate fragile negotiations through financial incentives. By striking Qatar, Israel did not simply target a geographic location, it assaulted the perception of diplomatic immunity Doha had long enjoyed. The shock was immediate across the Gulf, but the echo resounded far wider for Netanyahu, whose tenure has been defined by defiance, survival, and a willingness to court controversy. The strike was meant as a message of deterrence. He sought to demonstrate that no nation, regardless of wealth or diplomatic positioning, would be permitted to underwrite Israel's enemies without consequence. Yet what he failed to anticipate was the resonance this act would have among leaders in Africa, Latin America, and Asia who have long chafed under the assumption that some nations may act beyond the law while others must endure in silence. It was in Ouagadougou, in the heart of the Sahel, that Netanyahu's calculation began to unravel. Ibrahim Traoré is not a leader born of conventional diplomacy. At 30-something, he is the youngest head of state in the world, a soldier who rose from obscurity to power by leading a coup against a faltering regime. His legitimacy does not rest on polished speeches delivered at foreign universities, but on the promise to protect his people from jihadist violence and from the weight of external domination. In him, many Africans see a leader unafraid to reject Western prescriptions, unafraid to stand shoulder to shoulder with those who resist imperial diktats. His decision to respond forcefully to Israel's strike on Qatar cannot be understood as a random gesture of solidarity. It is the natural extension of a worldview in which Africa must no longer remain silent when international law is trampled and when the sovereignty of smaller states is shredded. In his speech, delivered with controlled intensity, Traoré did not merely condemn Israel. He spoke of a global system that has normalized selective justice. He recalled how African nations had endured centuries of resource exploitation and how today, under the guise of security partnerships, their independence is still constrained. His voice sharpened as he declared that if Qatar could be attacked with impunity today, then no small state, whether in Africa or elsewhere, could feel secure tomorrow. To many, his words echoed the historical rhetoric of Kwame Nkrumah, Thomas Sankara, and Patrice Lumumba, leaders who dared to link Africa's struggle with global currents of liberation. Netanyahu's shock was not in hearing condemnation. Israel has faced plenty of that, but in recognizing that the condemnation was not whispered from the margins. It was broadcast loudly from the heart of a continent Israel had once courted quietly, supplying weapons and offering technical expertise. For decades, Israel had cultivated relationships with African states, presenting itself as a partner in agriculture and technology. Yet, here was Traoré, rallying not only his people, but inspiring leaders across the Sahel and beyond to reconsider their ties. His words carried weight not because Burkina Faso commands vast wealth or military might, but because they tapped into a reservoir of frustration long buried in African politics. To comprehend why Traoré's intervention has such resonance, one must situate it within Africa's ongoing struggle for autonomy. The Sahel region has been battered by insurgencies, often armed and inflamed by the same geopolitical rivalries that play out in the Middle East. Foreign militaries operate bases across the region under the pretext of counterterrorism, yet the violence persists and often worsens. For leaders like Traoré, the conclusion is clear. Foreign presence is less about security and more about influence. Thus, when Israel asserts a right to strike Qatar for its alleged connections to resistance groups, Africans hear an echo of the same justifications used to intrude upon their own sovereignty. Traoré's refusal to stay silent, therefore, is a warning that the days of Africa's leaders bowing quietly are waning. The speech he delivered threaded together history, morality, and realpolitik. He reminded his audience that the same Western capitals that quickly defended Israel's right to self-defense had in the past shown little sympathy when African civilians were massacred by insurgents or when coups erupted in fragile states. He pointed to the hypocrisy of a global system that lectures Africa on democracy while turning a blind eye to authoritarianism when strategic interests are at stake. Most daringly, he questioned the silence of the Arab League, hinting that wealth and proximity had not translated into the courage to confront violations of sovereignty. That an African leader would so boldly challenge not only Israel but the wider architecture of international complicity gave his words a potency Netanyahu could not. Dismiss analysts who once dismissed Traoré as an inexperienced soldier now recognize the political instinct driving his actions. By aligning publicly with Qatar, he situates Burkina Faso as part of a broader axis of resistance, states and movements unwilling to accept a unipolar order dominated by a few Western powers and their allies. This alignment is not without risk. Israel possesses formidable intelligence networks, and its reach extends even into Africa. By speaking as he did, Traoré invites scrutiny, perhaps even pressure or destabilization. Yet therein lies the courage that makes his stance significant. He is not naive. He is deliberate. He knows that in a globalized information sphere, his words amplify the sense that Israel's impunity is not boundless and that resistance can emerge from unexpected quarters. Netanyahu's discomfort is heightened by the symbolic weight of the Sahel itself. Israel has invested in building quiet partnerships with states in the region, offering surveillance technology and counterinsurgency training. If those states begin to see association with Israel as a liability rather than an asset, then Netanyahu's strategy of breaking Arab and African solidarity through bilateral ties may falter. The Abraham Accords opened new doors for Israel, giving it unprecedented normalization with Arab states. Yet the strike on Qatar, coupled with Traoré's intervention, risks awakening a counter-movement, an alliance not defined by religion or region, but by shared opposition to unilateral aggression. One must also consider the psychological dimension of Traoré's speech. He framed the strike not only as an attack on Qatar, but as a test of global conscience. He drew on vivid imagery. A small nation bombed not because it posed an immediate military threat, but because it dared to host voices of resistance. He asked rhetorically whether African states, often dismissed as weak, should await the same fate when they reject dictates from stronger powers. Such framing transforms a distant event into an immediate concern for his audience. By doing so, he expands the battlefield of legitimacy, forcing Netanyahu to confront criticism not only from Arab or Western capitals, but from Africa's heart. The reactions were swift. Across West Africa, from Bamako to Niamey, leaders and activists amplified Traoré's message. On social media, young Africans hailed his courage, drawing parallels to Sankra's bold defiance of imperialism in the 1980s. Commentators noted that while Western governments may dismiss his words, they resonate deeply among populations yearning for leaders who speak without fear. Netanyahu, who prides himself on projecting strength, suddenly faced a different kind of challenge, one not from tanks or missiles, but from a voice that exposed the fragility of Israel's moral claim. What makes this moment transformative is not simply the content of Traoré's condemnation, but the larger shifts it signals. Africa is no longer a passive theater where external powers compete. Increasingly, its leaders are asserting themselves as active participants in global debates. By speaking on Qatar, Traoré demonstrated that Africa's concerns are not confined to the continent's borders. He positioned Burkina Faso as part of a moral coalition stretching across continents, united by the rejection of double standards. This is the shock Netanyahu felt, that an African leader, often presumed peripheral, could shape the narrative of a Middle Eastern crisis. The long-term implications are profound. Israel, accustomed to managing its Arab adversaries, now finds itself facing criticism from unexpected directions. The narrative of self-defense, long the bedrock of its justification, is increasingly challenged by voices that highlight the disproportionality of its actions and the precedent they set for smaller states. Traoré's words may not change Israel's military calculations, but they chip away at its diplomatic armor, eroding the assumption that its narrative will be passively accepted outside the West. As days pass, analysts will dissect every phrase of his speech, weighing its implications for Africa's relations with the Gulf, for the trajectory of the Sahel's struggle against jihadism, and for the broader architecture of international law. Yet what is undeniable is that the image of a young African captain addressing Israel's most entrenched leader is one that history will not easily forget. The shock it delivered to Netanyahu lies in the realization that the moral battlefield is shifting and that voices from unexpected quarters can no longer be ignored. In the final measure, the strike on Qatar may prove to be more than a tactical miscalculation. It may be the spark that inspired leaders like Ibrahim Traoré to remind the world that sovereignty is not the privilege of the powerful, but the right of all. And in standing firm, he has shown that Africa's voice, once silenced, can thunder with a force that unsettles even the most seasoned of global leaders.